DiCaprio. George's been a Libertarian member for longer than most of us have been alive, I think. No shade, obviously, but...
Anybody here born before 1972? Okay.
So he got to vote.
80?
Did you vote for the first Libertarian candidate for president, or the one after that?
You know, it's hard to say. I may not have heard about the Libertarian Party until after that election.
Okay, gotcha. So at least by
I actually voted for George McGovern in my first opportunity to vote.
Gotcha. So he also helped to found the Lynchburg Libertarians Alliance. Is that what it's called?
It was Lynchburg Libertarian League.
Lynchburg Libertarian League back in the 90s. And he's been a member ever since. And he is here to talk to us about free market economics, more specifically the Austrian School of Economics that Mises and Jason, Hayek, and Rothbard are going to be a part of. So without further ado, you're George.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for showing up to this.
Just curious, how many of you are members of the College Libertarian Club? Okay, so the folks on the back row are, I'm especially glad that you're here. Are you all fairly familiar with libertarianism or with economics in general? So, okay. Well, what I want to do is basically answer three questions. Number one, what is economics? Number two, what is a free market? And number three is, what does economics have to say about free markets, specifically how the results of the free market compare with alternative organizations of an economy. And when we talk about alternative organizations of an economy, obviously a free market is one, and it's characterized by property rights being fully protected. And to the extent that property rights are aggressed against, you have a more and more controlled economy until you get to a pure command economy like the Soviet Union or North Korea. So there's basically a spectrum. You have completely untrammeled property rights. You have completely aggressed against property rights, and then you have a spectrum in between, depending on how much aggression is going on. So, all right, let me start by trying to define exactly what economics is. Of course, it comes from the word economize, which means that to economize means to try to get the greatest satisfaction at the lowest cost. So humans have resources at their disposal. Hopefully they have property that they can use to meet their goals. And economics is all about how they go about utilizing that property in the most efficient way to gain the most important satisfactions for themselves. And of course, in the field of economics, we talk about terms such as goods, scarce goods, human goals, production, consumption, land, labor, capital, value, price, money. So those are all the subject areas of economics. So basically, the science of economics is aimed at discovering economic laws. Now, this is an interesting question because this chart gives kind of a history of economic thought over the years, and I'm going to be talking about the Austrian School, some of these, Karl Menger, Friedrich von Wieser, Eugen von Marburg, and then, of course, when we get down into the 20th century, we have Mises and Rothbard and Hoppe on this slide, but I'll talk a little bit about them as well. But in this period up at the top, of course, the mercantilists had a completely screwed up idea of what the proper economic policies were. Around the time of the American Revolution, Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations. that was about the time that economics came together as a recognized discipline, organized field of study. And of course, Smith pointed out the supreme importance of the division of labor in increasing productivity, and that there actually is a natural unity of interest between people, because by working together with others and dividing labor, we can be much, much more productive and therefore much, more able to satisfy our wants. But that was kind of the state of the field for the 19th century until Carl Menger came along. And there was a big problem at that time. Economics had kind of come to a dead end because they were having trouble answering some questions that arose around the idea of value. And the problem is that most economists, or many economists, had some sort of an idea that value was inherent in the goods that were being produced. And there was something about the production of these goods that was imbuing them with value. And in some sense, that value was something that could be measured and compared between different goods. Menger came along and he said, no, you got that all wrong. Value is entirely subjective to each individual. It's a ranking or evaluation of a good according to what your own needs and goals are. So obviously I'm going to value, I don't know, I'm not looking around the room, but I'm going to value this laptop more highly than I would value anybody else's laptop because it's got all my data on it, right? Okay, so that was the answer that Menger gave, and he worked out the whole system of analyzing economics based on that principle of individualism and individual subjective evaluation. So I mentioned that economics is concerned with uncovering economic law, and also brought this poster up to point out that you can see it's a pretty scattered field, and not all economists, even today, fully buy into the subjective theory of value. And there are certainly several other ideas that the Austrians have that have not been entirely accepted, or which were at once accepted pretty generally and then have been come to be rejected by mainstream economists. But, as a matter of fact, one of the differences is that, for example, the German Historical School here, they were coming along about the same time as the Marginalists, the Austrian School, and there was a great disagreement. These were both basically, Central European German economists, and the German Historical School said there are no economic laws. We've got economic phenomena over time. We can study history. We can take statistics, and that's basically about all we can do. And there's not really any point in looking for an underlying theory. And of course, that's exactly opposite to the Austrian approach. So again, we're talking about laws. So I want to talk about three different types of laws that are relevant in this discussion. Everyone's familiar with scientific or natural laws, law of gravity. And obviously these are things that are built into reality. There's no way to break it as a law. But we can discover what the law is by using the scientific method, observing phenomenon, forming a hypothesis as to what the cause might have been, and then designing experiments to either confirm or invalidate that hypothesis. And obviously that has been an extremely successful method of advancing science over the last 400 years. Economic laws are very similar in the fact that they are unbreakable laws. They are part of reality. But unlike scientific laws, they can't be described in a precise mathematical equation. With the law of gravity, you can write out the equation, You can make predictions, precise predictions of what's going to happen if certain things are put into place. With economic law, you can make predictions, but the predictions are not, they're not precise. They're not, I couldn't tell you exactly what's going to happen if I put in this policy, but I can say, if I put in this policy, then this factor will be greater than or less than it would have been if I hadn't put the policy in place. So the predictive power is, we can look at particular ways of conducting economic policy, and we can predict what the impact will be in a comparative sense, but not in a precise mathematical sense like you can with scientific laws. So that's the main difference. And one of the results of that difference with the scientific laws, you don't really even need to quantify them or mathematize them to demonstrate to people. I mean, if I want to prove the law of gravity, all I got to do is pick something up and drop, okay? And it's easy to see. If I want to prove an economic law, economic laws are discovered through beginning with basic principles that are true a priori. In other words, they're true statements that can't be disputed. And I'll get to what the fundamental axiom of Austrian economics is in a moment. But so you start with these true axioms, and then you use logical reasoning to work out the implications of those facts. And that's really the method of the Austrian School. And so that means to prove an economic law, you can only prove it to someone who can follow a often somewhat complicated chain of reasoning and be convinced through that way. There's really no way to demonstrate an economic law, again, because you can't make a precise prediction and say, okay, I'm going to show you what happens if we raise the interest rate 5% and then run an experiment and see. It's not going to happen, okay? There's no way to repeat the kind of conditions to do an experiment. And again, we're talking about a cause and effect system where the cause is the human will. And the human will is variable and it's changing, so it's certainly not something that can be mathematically predicted. So those are the big differences between scientific and economic law, and as you can see, it makes it a little more difficult to prove economic law, and that's what makes it very difficult to get the public behind supporting candidates who understand the economics, as opposed to candidates who basically use false economic principles just to gain votes. Okay, there's a third type of law that is relevant to this, and particularly relevant to free markets, and that's what we would call moral law or ethics, and in specific, the moral law that libertarians call the non-aggression principle. And I assume everyone's familiar with what that is. Okay. So, to move on to the next question, well, the difference between moral law and these other two types of laws I've been talking about, obviously, they're not prescriptive laws. I'm sorry, they're not descriptive laws, they're prescriptive. In other words, they're, rather than statements of cause and effect relationships in the world, they're statements of what human behavior ought to be in given circumstances. And so these laws are binding in the sense of governing behavior only for those who accept them as laws, who consciously choose to follow those laws. And obviously, the great majority of people want to abide by moral laws, and most of us do a fairly good job of it. I'm sure everyone's slipped up from time to time. And but that's the difference. And so for a free market, it cannot exist unless the moral laws are in effect. Obviously, the scientific and the economic laws are in effect in any case. Like I said, those are unchangeable. But we have to have moral law being effective or else a free market can't exist. And so the obvious problem with that is that not everyone is willing to be bound by moral law. So there has to be some mechanism for those who do wish to, to use that framework to enforce moral law on those who are unwilling to restrain themselves. And that's where we start getting into politics and government and so forth. And I may discuss that somewhat more at the end if people are interested, but I'm going to kind of skip over it from now and talk as if we lived in a fairly ideal world where moral law was effective in all cases. Yeah.
Does libertarianism believe that the non-aggression law should be enforced by the government? Should it be, or is it just like a moral compass for people?
That's a good question. And that was kind of what I was going to get to at the end. So do you mind if we hold it until the very end and just make sure you remind me? Yeah.
I gotta swallow my pride. What's the non-aggression principle?
Oh, okay, the non-aggression principle. Anybody want to jump in or I?
So the non-aggression principle is essentially, it's tied to the golden rule in a way. It's the general principle that people have the freedom to do what they want as long as it doesn't hurt other people.
Yeah. So it's basically aggression is defined as
Or the property of others.
Right, violating other people's rights.
well, aggression is. I'm going to go ahead and get into it right now. Aggression is defined as the the violation of property rights, basically. Obviously, our first property right is our right to ourselves, to our own bodies, and to the labor of our own bodies. So any aggression against that, murder or slavery, anything of that sort, would obviously be an aggression against property. And then theft or destruction of someone else's property against their will, that would be aggression. So that's what we're talking about. So the non-aggression principle says the only thing that limits human behavior is that you limit yourself to not aggressing against others. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't use force if someone has aggressed against you. So there's certainly a place for defensive aggression, if you want to call it, or it's really not aggression at that point. It's you're combating aggression by using forceful means, and that's where the need for a government comes in. Now, I am a voluntarist, which is what we're trying to call ourselves now. Another term is anarcho-capitalist, but I tend to agree with Perry Willis that anarchy is just too much of a loaded term. So, but even as a voluntarist or an anarchist, I believe in government. What I don't believe in is the state, which is a monopolistic government, which simply declares its own reign over some geographical area and then claims that they're the only ones who are able to use force legitimately in any case. Yeah.
So you believe there should be some type of regulation for businesses?
Absolutely, and I'll talk about what that is. So yeah, so government is that enforcement mechanism that I talked about. Like I said, that has to be there unless everybody in the world decides suddenly, okay, I'm going to follow the non-aggression principle. And it'd be great, but that's never going to happen. So you have to have a government, but it's a mistake to call the state a government, actually, because the state engages in aggression constantly. So the state is not a true government because it's, it may protect your property to some extent, but it's also violating your property constantly. And the kind of government that's needed is one that will also follow the non-aggression principle. So, all right, let's see where I'm at here. All right, so we're talking about property, and as I said, basically a free market boils down to a market within which property rights are completely protected. If you own something, then it's yours to control, it's yours to exchange with someone else, give away, destroy, whatever you want to do with it, and no one else has any of those rights for that property. And of course, that's never really existed in the world because we have these monopolistic states. But there are three ways to justify property under the non-aggression principle, or how to define ownership of property. The first is appropriation of goods from nature. So if you go out through the woods and you see a bush of berries and start picking the berries, those berries are yours. Okay, nobody else, unless somebody else owned the land and told you not to be there. And then of course there's production, taking what you've appropriated from nature and other goods that have either been already produced or also appropriated from nature, combining them together and producing a new product, which is more suitable for meeting the need. And of course, the final way to acquire property is through a transfer of ownership, either through an exchange, a voluntary exchange with another person, or as a gift. So those are basically the only three ways that you can acquire a property title to a good. I'm sorry?
Legitimately?
Legitimately, yes, yeah. And of course, transfers of ownership can occur, well, actually, even illegitimately, because my next point was transfers of ownership can occur either voluntarily or coercively. So I certainly have the ownership of a good chunk of my money transferred to the federal government and the state government every year, and the county government. And I'm never really volunteering to have that happen, but it happens anyway. So again, this is something that's an ideal to strive for. It's never really existed. But probably the best approximation that we have to look at is the United States during the 19th century, and especially the later part of the 19th century. And that was a very close approximation to what we would call laissez-faire capitalism, or pure free market, certainly compared to what we've had since about 1913. Okay. So, I answered the first two questions, and I guess I want to talk about, like I said, what economics tells us about free markets. And what I want to look at here is first of all, some of the unique contributions that the Austrian economists made. What makes them different from other schools of thought in economics, or at least what they originally contributed to the field. And then I'll look at a couple of significant theoretical contributions that they made, or theoretical conclusions they've come to based on their theoretical structure that are very significant, and probably one of the greatest contributions in economics in the 20th century, I would say, or a couple of the most important. All right, so for their unique contributions, and a lot of this came from Carl Menger, I think. Let me throw this slide up here. These are some of the major names associated with the Austrian School. Carl Menger, 1840 to 21. He had students Friedrich von Wieser, Eugen von Baumberger. Ludwig von Mises was a student of Friedrich von Wieser. Murray Rothbard and Friedrich Hayek were both students of Mises, and Hans Hermann Hoppe. I believe he was a student of Rothbard. And he's the only one on this chart still living, but these are the names that are mostly associated with it. Mises kind of encapsulated the whole Austrian theory into this, about 912 pages. And I'm not going to try to go over what the principles of economics are that the Austrians discovered in any detail. I'm sure I'll touch on a few, but that's where you need to go if you want to read that. Okay, so unique contributions. So the first one I've already touched on. That's individualism. The fact that everything in Austrian economics, or that the Austrian School teaches, goes back to the individual and his subjective valuations and motivations. A lot of schools of economics, in order to analyze economic phenomenon, they kind of create out of thin air these aggregates, like the general price level, what's the gross domestic product, GDP, or is it, I guess it's GNP now. But they create these aggregates and kind of assume a static situation, because it makes it possible to use mathematics, because what they're trying to do is emulate the scientific method that's used in developing scientific laws, and that simply doesn't work. But that was one of the contributions. Another big one was this idea of subjective valuation. We already talked about that somewhat. But what Menger also pointed out was that, as I said, before that, economists had been tending to think of value as something inherent in the product and to also equate it with price. So the idea if something has a certain price, then that's its value, and that makes value measurable. As I said, value is not measurable. Since it's totally subjective, how am I going to measure the way you feel about something within your own mind? So subjective valuation. So price is not value. Price is simply an exchange ratio that two people are able to agree on in making an exchange of two goods. Now, of course, this book, and also Rothbard's great book, Man, Economy, and State, which is actually probably, if I was going to recommend a textbook on economics, that's what I would recommend, would be Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State. It basically is the same, goes over the same ground as Mises did in his great book, but it's a little more systematized as laying out an outline of what the economic system is. Whereas Mises it's not quite as well structured and as an academic subject if you're going to sit down and study it, but it's certainly worth reading. If you have that much interest in economics. So the subjective valuation leads to concepts like the opportunity cost. Usually when you ask what does something cost, you say, well, it's X number of dollars. You're talking about the price. The actual cost to someone, given that the value to a person is subjective, the opportunity cost of a acquisition of property or an act, human action, we're talking about why do people act, and so the opportunity cost of a particular act is what is the thing that would be next most valuable to you that you have to give up in order to do that act. So I was thinking of an example. There's the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn holds frequent colloquia and so forth, and they were holding one, I believe, in April, which I was interested in attending, but I've got family visiting that same week. So obviously the price of the colloquium, if I went, I'd have to pay for the cost of travel and lodging and pay for the conference itself. So that's the higher priced item. I mean, visit from family, they're just going to show up. I've got to feed them. So obviously price has nothing to do with that opportunity cost. To me, giving up visiting with my family would be a greater cost than going to the conference. So the cost to me is giving up the conference. Okay, that's what opportunity cost means. And we also have the price discovery mechanism, which comes about Actually, I'm gonna disconnect here and pull the screen up and just draw a little chart. This is pretty basic economic concept. So this is price. This is quantity supplied of a good. And two of the economic laws that are basically accepted by all economists, not just the Austrians, are that as price increases, the quantity purchased or procured goes down. So your curve is always going to look like that. And by the same token, the higher the price, the larger quantity is going to be supplied by producers or suppliers. That line's going to go up like that. And this is the price that is going to emerge on the market. And the reason for that is that at that price, everyone for whom that good is worth more than the money he paid for it will get that good. And every supplier for whom the money is worth more to him than the good will get the money. So both sides are going to be satisfied with the bargain. That's kind of an amazing thing, but it's true. Everyone becomes wealthier when an exchange takes place because value is subjective. So your own personal feeling of wealth is going to increase. Now, of course, after the fact, you may change your mind about what you purchased and so forth, but at the time of the exchange, both parties are going, in a free market are going to be better off. And of course, so that's why when we talk about things like minimum wage laws, now we're talking about interventions. We want to somehow bring the price down. So let's see, which curve is this going to move? We're saying that basically what the curve will be moved. So there's quantity. So yeah, okay, so the price is going up, but the quantity is going to go down. So for example, again, minimum wage laws. The suppliers of labor, or the workers, if you constrain the price that they can charge for their labor to a particular value, then less labor is going to be required or demanded. So somebody's going to lose their jobs. You know, a few people are going to make a little more money, but some people are going to lose their jobs, and there's just no way around that. And you just can't seem to convince people. And again, this is a good example of what I was talking about earlier. You can't prove economic laws by making predictions. I remember a friend of mine on Facebook that we have frequent arguments over. He's a real progressive, a high school pal of mine. He always sends me links to studies like, I think it was in Seattle, maybe, when they raised their minimum wage, and they still had job growth. Okay, like I said, I couldn't predict that raising the minimum wage would make job growth stop. But what I could predict is that if you hadn't raised the minimum wage, the job growth would have been even greater. So that's the kind of prediction that economic laws can make. And but it's, like I say, it's very hard to prove because you say it would be greater than if we hadn't put in, but then you can't you can't just do an experiment and check that out. Yes?
To what degree, if any, are corporations morally obligated to provide their employees with a living wage as
I don't know.
Is it about the living wage?
What?
Is it about the living wage, though, or is it about what value they add to the company?
well, that's the crux of the question.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think there's any moral obligation on the part of a purchaser of labor to provide any particular level of wage. And any person who wants to work for him is perfectly free to accept the arrangement he offers or not.
Exactly.
And
If the business owner is given the moral obligation to provide a living wage, then why is a consumer not given the obligation to purchase something at the highest level possible to give that person, you know, their living wage?
Right,
afterwards?
yeah. And that's an example of an intervention that some politician might dream up at some point. Wouldn't surprise me a bit. Okay. So, the subjective valuation and everything that goes along with that, and that's probably a major contribution that Menger made to the field, because that's really pretty important. The third thing I wanted to talk about in connection with Menger was the idea of marginalism. Are you familiar with the term marginal utility? This is the idea, like I said, since value is subjective, everyone has some sort of ranking of values. You know, everything that I desire, something's going to be at the top of the list, and that's going to be what I choose to act upon at any given time. Obviously, that list can change and switch constantly, but you're always going to have basically a ranking. This is number one, this is number two. And if I can't do this, then I'll go down to number two. And so that opportunity cost, like I said, is that number two goal that you had to give up. Now, marginal value is at the other end. If you think about it, if you have this ranked list of goals that you want to achieve or needs that you want to satisfy, and those needs can all, so you have several needs that can all be satisfied by a single homogeneous good, say a gallon of water. So I've got at my disposal 100 gallons of water. I can use the first one for drinking, I can use the next one for cooking, I can use the next one for bathing, I can use the next one for watering plants. But each of those things is lower on my list. So the value of that gallon is going down as I'm able to fulfill more and more of my needs. So the marginal value of a gallon of water is basically the value to you of that very last gallon. If you had to give that up, what would you be losing? And if you've already satisfied a whole lot of your other important needs, it might be, it might be pretty trivial. Maybe you're using it to fill up water guns and shoot at your little brother or something. But that's the marginal value of a gallon of water, is what you would have to give up if you lost that last gallon. Now, that, I think I'm trying to remember where I was going with that, but that was also a contribution of Menger. Yes.
But of course, it's got to be in relation to the amount.
Right. Yeah. It's the goods in your possession, in your stock of goods. Right.
So the marginal value of 1 gallon of water compared to 100 gallons of water is different.
Right. But again, now I remember what I was missing there for just a moment. This explains one of the puzzles that economists had up until the time of Menger was, how do you explain the fact, for example, that a cart of bread is priced at, say, $300 and a diamond is priced at several $1,000s. Obviously, bread is something extremely useful to people, particularly back in that period of history. There were a lot of people in the world who probably ate very little else. So how do you, a diamond, yeah, they're pretty, and rich people like to wear them on their fingers, but they certainly are not of that much use. So why are they so much more expensive? And again, it gets to right to what you're saying. It has to do with the available stock. We're not talking about all the bread in the world and all the diamonds in the world. If you had to choose between those two things, the bread might be more valuable, but a single loaf of bread or a cart of bread. In fact, Menger used the example of a cart, but that's what explains that paradox. Okay, another contribution of the Austrian School, and I'm not so sure that this is entirely from Menger or just kind of in general across the board here with the development, is their dynamic analysis of an economy. Like I said, a lot of other schools of thought in economics use some fairly static ideas because that's the only way they can come up with mathematical models to achieve what they're trying to achieve. But the Austrians recognized that there really is no, that the idea of a static or a stable economy, what the Austrians would call a evenly rotating economy, or the ERE, is useful as an analysis tool. And the idea of an evenly rotating economy is, suppose that one day suddenly everything stopped changing, so that from that point on, everything that you'd ever done, you would just keep doing. Everything you bought, you'd buy the same quantity at the same time. It would wear out at the same rate. So everything's just kind of going and churning in a unchanging pattern. Now, for one thing, no one would ever be uncertain about the future. So profits and losses would disappear from the picture. No one would be able to make a profit because you'd always know exactly what you'd be able to attain on the market. You'd know exactly what it was to cost to produce an item. So the Austrians use that as an analytical tool, but while recognizing that that's simply an imaginary thought experiment, I guess you'd say. But they use that to look at what's causing things to tend toward an equilibrium, but they also understand that there's never going to be a state of equilibrium reached. So you can't make any conclusions based on it, on assuming that there's actually an equilibrium in the economy. So that's fairly significant. It kind of is the difference between micro and macroeconomics. Macro is looking at a long term, where the idea is that long term there's some kind of stability in the economics, but there's not. The Austrians say the long term is nothing but a long series of short terms, and every one of those short terms is going to be changing and moving. I feel like I skipped over something important here, but maybe it'll come back to me. All right, so let me jump back. I said there were a couple of theoretical conclusions that the Austrians have arrived at that are fairly significant. Actually, there are three of them. The first one, again, goes back to Menger, and that is he was the first to really adequately explain the origin of money. And he explained it by saying that obviously money is a good that's not valued as a consumption good, it's valued strictly as an exchange good, which means that you would buy it because you thought that you could take it and then exchange it for something else. Everyone's aware that if we had to operate on a barter system where we just had to trade items that we produced for other items that people had produced, it would be a very clunky and unworkable system. So money is an incredible human invention that really makes our lives possible. But how does money arise? I remember when I was about 5 years old playing a friend of mine in a sandbox out behind my house, and I was thinking about money. How come the government gets to print all this money? And a lot of people just assume, money is something that the government invented, or the state invented, I should say, and that's why it's valuable and that's why we use it. But the original, the origin of money was explained by Menger in this way. At any time on the market, again, let's assume that there is no money right now. So people are operating on a barter system. And interestingly, there's very little, not archaeological, what's the, Margaret Mead, paleontological, no, that's paleontology, that's dinosaurs. Anyway, anthropology, there we go. There's very little anthropological evidence that there's ever really been a widespread barter system in any human society. Even in very primitive societies, they basically live in a society which basically shares everything, a communist society if you wanted to look at it in that way. So barter is not really necessary, but once you get into a settled agricultural community, very, very quickly the need for something like money comes up. And the way it arises is, in the marketplace, there's going to be all these goods for sale, some of which you want for direct consumption. And so if you go to the person who has what you want and you say, okay, what can I trade you for this? If you don't have what he needs, you can find out what he needs, and maybe you can find somebody else who has what he needs and who has what you need, and so you can trade with them and then go back over to the other guy and trade. So that's an indirect exchange. And so the demand for any good on the marketplace is mostly going to come from consumption demand, obviously, but a few goods that are very commonly used by everyone are going to be are going to have part of their demand accounted for by the demand for using them in an indirect exchange. And obviously, as people see a particular item being used by other people, that is going to increase the exchange demand for that item. And items that aren't being used very much, the exchange demand is going to go down. And over time, one or two items are going to simply kind of race to the top, because as their exchange value goes up, more and more people say, well, we need this for exchange, and now more and more people saying everybody's using it, that's even better for exchange. So, you know, it's the network principle, right? So that was Menger's explanation of the origin of money, which was one of the theoretical contributions he made. But the most important one, or actually not, these next two are pretty big both in themselves. I'm not sure which was most important, but one of Mises's great achievements was explaining the socialist calculation problem. Now, socialism is not terribly well understood these days, I don't think, but the original definition of socialism was social ownership of the means of production. So all capital goods, everything that's used to produce later stage goods. I didn't really explain that the Austrians look at the structure of production. They said there's a consumer goods that can be directly used to meet a need, and those are the level one goods. I think level is the right word, but okay, so you've got the lower level. Lower level goods are the consumption goods, so they're directly useful in meeting a need, like a ham sandwich. That's a consumer good. Now, producer goods would be things like the loaf of bread, the slice of ham, the mustard, the knife that you needed to spread the mustard and mayonnaise, and so forth. So those are all separate goods that go into the process of creating that final consumer good. So those are considered producer goods. And of course, and so that's one level up. And so as you get higher and higher in this level of production, you have more and more stages to go through before you finally reach a finished consumer good. And I don't have a whole lot of time left, but I'm going to try and finish this up. So in a socialist society, the idea is that all of those producer goods, all of those capital goods would be under social control, which of course in reality means they're going to be under somebody's control. And it's probably not going to be you and me, it's going to be whoever managed to gain control of the political apparatus of that society. And if they own all capital goods, what does that mean about the prices of capital goods? It means you don't know what the price is. There's no way to set a price because you can't buy or sell. You can't go into the marketplace and see how much I could get for this if somebody else needs it more than what I'm using it for. So there's no price for producer goods. So there's no way for the planners in a centrally planned society to come up with a rational allocation of goods. They have nothing to base it on. Prices, of course, send the signal. If a price is high, that sends the signal to suppliers, we need to make more of this stuff. And they do. In a free market, they're free to enter that field and they're free to start producing. And so the supply will go up and the price will come down. If the price is low, then some suppliers are going to drop out. They can't they can't sell that good given their cost of production. So the marginal producers, the guys who are producing at the highest cost, are going to drop out, so the supply is going to drop. And now the price is going to start to rise again. So that's how prices coordinate our allocation of goods in society and the production of goods. But in a socialist society, you have no way of allocating those producer goods because you have no way of knowing what the prices are. The only reason that a society like the Soviet Union could exist for a century is because they were in the middle of a world that was operating in a quasi-capitalist state, and so there were prices for producer goods on the outside markets, and they were able to kind of feed off those in making some of their decisions. But without that input, if the entire world were under a socialist system, you'd just be out of luck in terms of planning any kind of a rational, non-wasteful utilization of the resources that you had at your disposal. So that's the socialist calculation problem. That was, I think Mises came up with that in a paper, I think around in the 1920s, and just really kind of blew a hole in socialism, which was quite a rising ideology at that time, just as it is now. So that was one of their major conclusions. The other one is the trade cycle theory, the boom-bust cycle. Everyone knows that businesses seem to go through these cycles where everything's going great, and then we have a recession or a depression, and everything goes downhill, and then sooner or later we get it straightened out. And of course, this is one of the things that is used as a criticism of capitalism by most critics of capitalism, is to say there's just something wrong with capitalism. It's inherently unstable, and so it is causing these boom-bust cycles. But the Austrians developed a trade cycle theory that explains the important facts much better than this simple-minded idea that there's just some kind of instability in the system that just makes this happen. And I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. It's 7:59. I don't know if people have to leave or anything, but just, if you you can cut me off if you want to. But so the trade cycle theory, the origin of the boom phase of a boom-bust cycle is due to basically loose credit, which is issued by banks using the fractional reserve system. Are all of you familiar with fractional reserves, or does that make any sense? The way a bank, this is interesting, because I had a class, I think in 4th grade on economics, and they went over how banks create money, and it always never made any sense to me. And for years and years I would think about that lesson and say, this doesn't make any sense. But the idea is that when a bank loans money, under a gold standard, for example, they would actually be lending gold. They might lend it in the form of a checking account, but the checks that you wrote on that account, when you cashed at another bank, that other bank would come to your bank and take the gold out of the vault to settle that check. Under a fiat money system like we have now, and even under that, even under a gold standard, banks could still issue more checking accounts than they actually had gold to cover, because they knew that not all those checks were going to come due at the same time. So if they could make a fairly good forecast of how much money they needed to have on hand at any given time, actual cash money to pay out to people who had demands on their deposits, then they could stay in business. But occasionally you'd have bank runs where everybody wanted their money back at once and the bank just didn't have it. And what happens then, or what happened then, in most places, certainly in the United States in the 19th century and very much in the 20th century, is the state would step in and back up the banks by either saying, well, we're suspending redeemability. In other words, the banks don't have to give you the gold anymore. They'll just say, you keep that paper check and you can keep passing that around as money, but you're not getting your hands on the gold. And of course, today, under the Federal Reserve System, The only thing you can redeem your paper money for is another piece of paper that looks exactly the same. So it really is a moot point, which makes it possible for the banks to issue loans in any amount they want to. So the loan becomes an asset on their books. And so, on their books, it looks like they've got, this many assets, but some of those assets are loans which may or may not get paid. So a fractional reserve banking system is one where banks are allowed to issue loans in excess of what their actual reserves of cash are. And that's the kind of system we have now. And basically the Federal Reserve oversees the whole thing. Okay, but to get back to the business cycle, since banks are able to easily increase credit, manipulate interest rates, what interest rates do are coordinate human activity over time. Another thing the Austrians do a much better job of than most of the other schools of thought is to take into account time. That's obviously an economic good, and it's something that has an effect. Again, on like I said, their dynamic analysis of the economy, that a lot of that has to do with looking at time and looking at how much time it takes for changes to be made and so forth. So, normally interest rates are set by the amount of savings that people are putting into the banks. So if the banks have more deposits from savers, they have more reserves that they can loan against. And the fact that people are saving money now means that they're willing to suspend their own consumption for the future. So that means they're willing to consume less now, but in the future they plan to consume more. That's what they're saving for. And the interest rate kind of tells you, what is the level of that of savings, and how much actual resources out there in the economy to do things. So if you through state intervention, if you go in and lower an interest rate, as the Federal Reserve does, you make loans more freely available, and industries which are particularly interest sensitive are those industries which have long lead times. So for example, if you're building a new factory and you're looking at what it's going to cost you to borrow the money to buy all the equipment and the labors to build this factory and purchase the land and so forth, you can look at today's prices, figure out how much you're going to need, look at what the interest rate is. It's going to take you 10 years, you know about how much interest you're going to pay out over that period. And over a long period like that, a small change in the interest rate is going to make a big difference in whether that is a profitable project or not. So as interest rates go down, more and more of these projects are going to pop up and say, whoa, hey, you can do this now and you're going to make some money. Okay, well, so what happens is with artificial raising of the interest rate, you don't have additional savings, you don't have additional resources. You just get more money out into the marketplace, and you basically have price inflation. And so as this 10-year project goes along, all of a sudden the trucks you needed to haul the equipment, the truck drivers are making more money, so that's costing you more. And the equipment you need, the land you wanted to buy, all those prices are going up. A good example is, say, in the 2000s during the dot-com boom. Everybody's looking, all I got to do is put together a website and I can make billions. And so they figure out, well, I need to hire some web programmers and blah, 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 blah. Well, in 1991, a web programmer, I don't know, when did Berners-Lee develop the web? Anyway, it was sometime around there. Web programmers were really cheap. There wasn't much demand for them, so, but, once this boom took off, I'm sure the salaries of those programmers went right through the roof, and all the calculations of getting this website up and running, were completely thrown off. So it's that kind of effect that they're talking about. So that leads to the bust. That's what the bust is basically very unusual, because obviously businesses are going out of business all the time. So there's constant failure in new business formation. But in a boom bust, you have all of a sudden a lot of formation of new business, particularly in the capital goods area, and you have, and things are going great, and then all of a sudden you have a cluster of entrepreneurial errors where all these entrepreneurs who figured out how they could make a profit suddenly see that they were wrong, and now they have to close down their plan, and everything they spent on it so far is most likely wasted. I mean, you probably will be able to get resell some of the stuff that you bought, but a lot of stuff will have just gone to waste. So that's what causes the bust cycle. So does that make sense to everybody? So that was the other really great contribution of the Austrians. That's pretty much all I got. Like I said, it's past 8. So does anybody have any questions they want to ask? Or?
I want to do Q&A and then questions.
What's that?
Well, I want to get a picture Q&A if you want to have any questions. I know Kate had a question. She told me she had.
What do you think about intellectual property?
I hold 2 patents and I think they're criminal. Not that I made any money off of them. But yeah, intellectual property is not property. An economic good is a good that is scarce. And by scarce, I don't mean, it's impossible to find. I would just mean that there's not enough of it to satisfy every need that we might want to use it for. So air, we can use all the air we need, and there's so much more that nobody's ever going to run out unless you get yourself into a closed room or something. But so air is not an economic good. And ideas can be passed from individual to individual without, if you give me the knowledge that you've developed, you haven't lost anything. So it's not a scarce good, it's not an economic good, so it really can't be property. Unless it's treated as property by the dictate of the state. So yeah.
Do you think that, or what role do you think that the U.S. government had in either shortening or lengthening, say, the Great Depression by its monetary policies?
Oh, it was definitely lengthened, yeah. It was created.
Oh, yeah.
And it was lengthened, yeah.
Yeah.
Are you aware of the Depression of 1920?
Yeah.
Yeah. Immediately following World War I, the U.S. had been on a huge boom because of, a lot of exports to the warring states in Europe. And around 1920, there was a big crash. I think the stock market drop was even bigger than the 29 drop.
Is that because of the
And the government...
Tariff Act primarily?
What's that?
Was that because of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, or was that...
No, that was later. That was later. This is, I'm still talking about 1920, yeah. So yeah, there was a big crash when a lot of those export markets went away, but the state didn't step in and do a thing about it, and it was all over with in about, I think about 9 months.
Yeah, it righted itself.
Yeah. And then the 29 crash came along. Herbert Hoover was a huge interventionist. All Roosevelt did was just kind of extrapolated from what Hoover had gotten started.
Right. I think
And all of those policies directly contributed to the depth and the severity of the Depression. So.
Would you agree that we are in an extreme capitalist state?
Not by the definition that I've been using in this
like
presentation.
Extreme capitalism now in America. You think we're in extreme capitalism in America?
I'm not sure what you'd say by extreme. I would.
Extreme capitalism means corporations have more power than.
Okay, see that's where our definition of capitalism is differing. I think, well, do corporations have more? No, corporations don't have more power. Consumers have more power than corporations. Unless the corporations have the government as their
Right, so
customer, yeah.
Well, we're living it now, correct?
Well, that would be, people would call it corporate.
corporatism or cronyism, depending on
Well, yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. Do you think that has led to the rise of democratic socialism?
Yeah, I think it probably has. But again, it's a misunderstanding of what the reasons are for the problems that they're objecting to. And they're looking at exactly the wrong solutions.
I have a question. Do you think that things like public utilities are necessarily natural monopolies? Or is there another solution that has been historically overlooked?
I don't think that they're naturally monopolies. The Austrian, in particular Rothbard, said that there really is no such thing as a monopoly unless it is a state-instituted monopoly, such as a utility monopoly. But there really is no such thing as a natural monopoly. Again, market forces would determine what the prices were for utilities and how much was built and where it was built and so forth. But yeah, there's no need for government intervention into that. Yeah.
So Milton Friedman wrote that corporations should basically have no social responsibility, and in 2016, Nobel Prize winner Oliver Hart wrote basically a contrast to that by saying that his thought was incomplete by saying that because if a shareholder, let's say, Dick's Sporting Goods, he wrote this paper about right after Dick's Sporting Goods decided to stop selling weapons, I believe. So he basically,
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that part.
He wrote Oliver Hart wrote the essay by saying that, like by disagreeing with Milton Friedman that corporations should have no social responsibility because of the fact that their main goal should be to increase profits.
Right.
So he wrote a contrast in that by saying that how would he take into account saying a shareholder coming to a manager of a business by saying that I believe that we as Dick's Sporting Goods should stop selling weapons. So I just wanted to know your take on like the contrast between corporations having social responsibility and the contrast with Oliver Hart saying that they can't have that, and increasing profits shouldn't be the main goal of a corporation because of the fact that shareholders have their own personal belief that they can succeed in corporation through the corporation.
Well, I haven't read the essay, so I don't know that I could respond to it specifically, but what I would say is that corporation social responsibility is to make a profit, because what profits are indications that someone has found a way to reduce waste in the economy. And profits are always temporary. There's actually three components of profit. There's okay, give me a second. I know what the last two are. The first one is basically just interest on capital. There has to be a return on capital, again, because someone's loaning that capital over the time that it takes to put something into production. So, and if there's no interest to be gained from that, then nobody's going to put up the money and nothing's going to get done. The second component is called managerial remuneration. So that's part of your labor cost. If you think it, managers aren't usually thought of as labor, but they are, a necessary component in the production process, and they have to be paid or they're not going to be there. Okay, so that's the second component of profit, and those two have to be covered, or the project's not going to succeed at all, or it's going to have losses.
Right.
But the third component is entrepreneurial profit, which is what we're usually talking about when we talk about profit. And that is simply the amount over those costs, the interest on, the overall cost of production, which includes the interest on capital and the managerial cost. Anything above that cost of production is profit. And the fact that someone has found a way to produce something at a lower cost and still sell it at that price indicates that the previous production processes were wasteful in some way. And what this entrepreneur has done, if he successfully does that, successfully predicts a better way to put together the factors of production to produce a good and earn a profit, then he's actually done a social good, because he's made society wealthier, and that profit is going to disappear quickly, particularly in a free market, because everybody else is going to look at that and say, holy cow, look at the profit levels over in this industry. I'm going to put some money over there. So again, it's just like anything else with supply and demand. If there's a lot of profit, then there's going to be a lot of people chasing it, and that profit is going to slowly disappear. That's why there would be no profit or loss in a evenly rotating economy that I was talking about earlier, because all of those costs would be perfectly accounted for, but entrepreneurial profit, there'd be no room for that. Yes?
Well, I do believe, I think a company can do both at the same time, but I think there is a point where a company can be too greedy, and they do commit social injustices that happen, throughout,
Yeah.
history. But, so where do you find the line between making a profit and giving back to because I do believe a business does have a responsibility to the community, but it's not just in, there is a justice in giving jobs to the community, but where do you find the line between, like the non-aggression principle, where is it too much aggression for a company when it's trying to receive profits?
Well, again, it's, like I say, it's the non-aggression principle. If they're actually stealing other people's property in order to make those profits, then yeah, that's wrong. And the way they usually do that is by making the state their customer and then being funded through taxation, or actually being funded through money printing, so or inflation. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not, but yeah, I'm all for social responsibility. I certainly think corporations should not. What was it? Is it? What was it wasn't Apple, was it? Their motto was "Don't be evil."
Google.
Huh? Or
Google.
Okay, right. Yeah. Yeah, I think people should not be evil. But the other thing is, evil corporations on a free market would disappear very quickly, because there's nobody tells the consumer that they have to go patronize this corporation. So, and that kind of gets to the question earlier we were asking about regulation in a stateless society. Corporations want to make a profit, and they can only do that by satisfying their customers. So if they do things that are obviously, greedy or rapacious or whatever, they're going to lose customers, they're going to make losses, and they're going to go out of business. So that's the main form of regulation in a free market.
That's what we want, right?
Yeah, and beyond that, again, you still have to have protection against theft and so forth. So you have to have some sort of a government, as I said, a government which obeys the non-aggression principle, which means that government would have to be voluntarily funded as well. But that's not out of the question. It's out of the question for most people because they simply never even imagined a world like that. But it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. Yes?
Does insider trading is it against the non-aggression principle, or is it?
No. It's, anyway. Yeah.
Can you think of any example in a free market where a license would be required?
Just off the top of my head, I can't. And again, if you're talking about a license which is...
A business license?
Yeah, but if you're talking about a license which is coercively demanded, as opposed to, say, a certification or, you might... For example, I was a certified lead appraiser and received a certification from Carnegie Mellon University for the job that I did.
Well, what about medical license?
I'm sorry?
Medical license would have to disappear as well, correct?
Right, yeah. But again, I'm sure doctors would have to have some sort of a trusted organization to give them some sort of certification or validation before they would gain much of a practice, right?
Much of a practice, but the treatment itself is a consumer good because it's a means to satisfy one's want.
Right.
So that would mean that I could go to anybody that I would seek medical treatment from.
Right.
And that would probably drop the price of medical treatment dramatically in this country.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So a license wouldn't be required, but there would be some organizations that offer the license so that consumers would feel more protected if they chose to feel more protected.
Yeah, exactly like Underwriters Laboratory.
Right, that exists in a ton of situations around the world.
Yeah.
We have non-governmental organizations like the American Society for Mechanical Engineers or like non-governmental safety bodies that both issue regulations for how stuff can be manufactured and then also give certifications to professionals in that field. And the professionals aren't necessarily required to have that certification by the government, but the consumer knows that the product or the professional is, like, follows the standards of that organization. And the
Right.
organization has proved itself to be trustworthy in giving those certifications.
Yeah, exactly.
The market can solve that.
Anything else? I just thought of a lot of other things I could say, but I don't want to keep you all here too long. I did want to